get it working?
Woohoo!
Is that your screen?
That's my screen.
Then never mind. We'll show these all the time. Reactor.
Oh, and now this is. Oh, curses.
You can tell me that.
I just had to plug it into a Mac for it to.
There's a resolution set or something?
Anyone?
So welcome everybody to the Chicago Node.js Meetup. Bathrooms are men's bathroom on that side, women's bathroom over here. The guest Wi-Fi, the user is guest, the password is where's the sun. So singer, pastor, professor, author, and JavaScript evangelist. So please put your hands together for Reuben Lillie.
Yeah. Thanks, Justin. Is the mic working?
Yeah.
We're happy with that? Good. So as I'm pulling up my notes, I appreciate your patience. Before I press the big start slideshow button, I had a couple questions I wanted to ask you, so I can get an idea of who's in the room. Right, because JavaScript is an enormous topic, and JAMstack is a growing part of that. But if you could just raise your hands, how many of you consider yourself JavaScript developers? Okay. And how many of you, especially you JavaScripters, know what the JAMstack is already before I start my talk? Okay, cool. Is any of you already building things in the JAMstack? Okay, and of those of you who make Jam, how many of you would say that JavaScript is heavily involved or is almost exclusively what you use apart from the HTML and CSS that you write? That you would say that you're leveraging JavaScript in your JAMstack application. Okay, well then you don't have to listen to me. That's fine, or not. So let's hit the button. Start with leveraging the JAMstack. I'm going to see if this will advance. It will. Good. So a little bit about me. My Twitter handle is spelled the same way as my first and last name. No middle initial, no spaces, no punctuation. I've been coding since 2014. I've been an opera singer since my sophomore year of college. I've been a pastor since I was 15 years old. I got married in 2011. Now I teach at the school that I graduated from in both music and theology. And we had a child last year. My latest hobby turned freelance opportunity, as I'm also a parliamentarian. And perhaps the most important piece of information is that I'm a lifelong Pittsburgh Pirates fan. You want to make sense of those emoji? Three Rivers, anyone? Okay. And hopefully it all makes sense now. This evaluates to true, that I am certifiably a nerd, much like I feel like I'm in good company. So when we're going to talk about the Jam, as it were, what I want to invite us to do is to work our way backwards through the title of my talk. So we'll first talk about what the JAMstack is. Then we'll talk about the J for a little bit. And then we'll talk about how to leverage it, turn it into sparkles, unicorns, rainbows, lollipops times 10 to the positive power, right? So at its heart, JAMstack is an acronym, like so many things in our business. The J stands for JavaScript. The A stands for APIs, like our JSON REST-based APIs or our GraphQL dialects. And then you have some sort of markup, whether you're writing static HTML or whether you're converting that somehow from Markdown or ASCII-Doc or whatever other form, however you choose to get to HTML, right? which makes the JAMstack a little different than some of our other contrived acronyms that we have for stacks. So we think of the firstborn child, the lamp stack, as it were, with our Linux, Apache server, MySQL database, PHP for templating and database interaction, whatever PHP actually does. And we have the slightly, the middle child, let's call it, of the mean stack, where you're using no SQL database like Mongo, and you've got an Express app that's using Angular templates and it's leveraging the Node.js ecosystem somehow. The JAMstack is not, like those, is not a series of tools or products that you have to buy into per se and hope that they remain stable and secure and popular or something like that. Rather, the JAMstack at its core is really just a series of best practices, okay? And there are 6 basic best practices that come to mind. So first of all, you have a CDN. Instead of a self-hosted server that's sitting in somebody's room or a VPN or something like that, it's living on a CDN somewhere, whether that's through AWS or through a company like Netlify, or you're using GitHub Pages or something like that. You're serving static files from a CDN, which is fundamentally different than having to wait on a server that you're in charge of sweeping up after and hoping that it doesn't catch on fire somewhere, right? Oh, you're fine. Absolutely fine. So, what that offers us when we have our static content, we're not serving anything that needs to be rendered at request time. It's all pre-rendered markup. Does that make sense? We're making our HTML and everything at build time instead of when the client requests it, which makes it instantly and fundamentally faster than anything else that we can do. And it's kind of like this gift that keeps on giving, because it is fast and it's secure, because it's really hard to hack a static HTML page. I'm not even sure how you do that. I don't know how. Which I don't mean any disrespect for the other way of doing things, like in a mean stack approach or a lamp stack approach. But it is slower because you're painting things every single time someone loads that page. Even if you're caching as much as you possibly can, you're still making the request to the server that is sending it back. There's a longer pipeline that things have to go through. Instead of just making the request to the CDN, you have to go through a load balancer to the server and back through the chain, right? And beyond that brick wall of paths that you have to go through, there's sadness. Thirdly, the JAMstack is built on immutable and atomic deployments. What I mean by immutable is that each change that you make triggers a new deployment. And what I mean by atomic is that instead of only what you change being lost in this shuffle of when to deploy what, is that you're deploying basically a whole new copy of your instance atomically, so that it's stable each time. There are different ways that different hosting providers handle this, but it's that whatever change you make is coupled with a dependable copy of what you know is going to work, right? Fourth, the JAMstack leverages version control. Most of it lives right in Git anyway, so you could run a JAMstack site with something like GitHub Pages. Unlike, GitHub Pages, you have to pay for continuous integration and continuous deployment. Additionally, or maybe your company pays for it, but like it's not part of the freemium GitHub, but it is part of GitLab out of the box. And many JAMstack hosting providers also offer that, regardless of what GitHub instance you're using, so that your CI/CD pipeline is part of your version control in there somewhere. Which leads to the fifth point, is that you want to automate as much of that as possible, just like you would with a CI/CD pipeline. Whatever is automatable about this process, you're finding a way to automate, or your hosting provider is automating for you out of part of the service. And then finally, the sixth best practice is that whatever static content or statically pre-rendered content isn't shipping you out of the box, you are turning toward functions as a service, or serverless functions, like Lambda functions on AWS, or a hosting provider like Netlify offers, where there's a layer that you can have things like contact forms, or dynamic search, or push notifications, without having to have a server sitting somewhere waiting for traffic to go up and down. You know what I mean? So it's so that you don't have to have your own server. It's this wonderful problem that we figured out. You don't need one. So when I'm talking about JavaScript, I'm specifically using JavaScript in terms of vanilla JavaScript. Go to the next one. And I don't mean any disrespect for our framework users, especially if your employer uses a framework. There are plenty of JAMstack instances that leverage a framework. But the way that I want to talk about leveraging JAMstack today, or leveraging JavaScript in the JAMstack, I find that many times that we turn toward a framework, we're creating more litter than we're cleaning up after. And we're creating a barrier to entry that we don't necessarily need. And it's a little hard for me to swallow, especially for some of my clients that they're not hiring me to maintain their project, but they have some local JavaScript people that they can turn to. So I want to write as much as I can outside the context of, well, you also need to know how to use insert framework flavor of the day here. You know what I mean? So on staticgen.com, I jerry-rigged the site so it looked like there were a lot more listings. Because there are currently 260 static site generators. So if you can imagine an occasion where I want a static site generator that is written in this language and I can write templates in this language, there's some combination that probably meets your needs, at least one. And I want to imagine, well, wouldn't it be nice, JavaScript developer friends, if there were not only a framework that were written entirely in JavaScript, but that you could also write your templates in vanilla JavaScript, so that its entire DNA like exuded JavaScript from top to bottom, so that the only three languages I had to work in were HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's absurd in one sense to think that you would only use the native languages of the browser to write for the browser, but because we haven't been able to do it for 25 years. And yet, I have a solution for you. It's kind of like writing a love letter to yourself and to your users at the same time, without feeling like you have to be chained to a framework or another language or some other biohazard that creates another layer of complexity in there somewhere. So, right, all you need is these three merit badges, and a basic understanding of these can get you a lot farther than you ever thought imaginable. Insert Eleventy by Zack Leatherman. He works for the Filament Group, which used to be based out of Boston, now is entirely remote. In December of 2017, he launched this small project called Eleventy, which is basically takes the Jekyll static site generator? Anyone? The native static site generator for GitHub Pages. If you've ever used, it's written in Ruby. It's painfully slow. If you don't like Ruby, or if you don't know Ruby, it's really hard to customize. Eleventy does everything that Jekyll does, only in JavaScript, and it takes a lot of cues from a lot of other, shall we say, more mature static site generator projects. It is so intuitive to me, anyway. It's a breath of fresh air, especially if JavaScript is your jam. This is quickly becoming my favorite static site generator for a couple reasons. 3 reasons. It is crazy fast, like running away from zombies fast. The only static site generator that I found that's faster is Hugo, which is written in Golang, which is multi-threaded. So it's inherently faster than a single-threaded application, than a single-threaded runtime like JavaScript is. But we're talking like milliseconds here. It's negligible how much faster it is. I love it. Another thing that's great about Eleventy is that you can migrate. These are all migrating animals at your own pace. Where you could use Eleventy for a layer of your application and template at a time, and you could still be using another static site generator somewhere, or have your database instance somewhere else. But Eleventy is simple enough and flexible enough that you can. It's not an all or nothing monolithic architecture that you have to buy into, and you can migrate as much or as little as you want at your own pace, which is unheard of. And which also means it's that much easier to migrate away from in case something better comes along in the future. That's something that I appreciate. Then it is inherently flexible. How do you say flexible in emoji? It was something that I was struggling with, so I just came up with these different activities that I think you need to be flexible for. In that you're not just using one templating language, for instance. You actually have 11 different templating languages at your disposal right now, which is far and above what any of the other static site generators are offering right now. You can write, and they're independent from one another. So you can mix and match raw HTML or compiling from Markdown. You can write in JavaScript. You can write in JavaScript template literals if that's the only part that you want. You can write in Liquid, you can write in Nunjux, you can write in Handlebars, you can write in Mustache, you can write in EJS, you can write in Haml, you can write in Pug. And the developer community around Eleventy is working toward the option where if you want to use another templating language, especially if it's a JavaScript-based templating language, that he's developing a relatively painless plugin architecture for you to, in a couple lines, be able to use your preferred front matter or template structure. Which brings me to right around that time with the 11th hour. And I'm not sure how much more time you want me to spend talking, because I don't have a timer. But now that we're here, let's do a demo. The fun part is what you were just watching was built in Eleventy. I built that entire slideshow with Eleventy for you. This is your basic structure with the GitLab repo. You can visit this yourself if you want. My username, GitLab/Reuben Lillie/J in JAMstack, if you want to pull it up yourself. So it looks like a Node app because it's running. It's running in the Node ecosystem that you can leverage, right? I'm going to come around this way, and there's a configuration file in here. This is entirely optional. Can we blow this up somehow? Maybe? Yeah. So just requiring a couple modules up here, basically to interact with the file system and to do some minifying for some HTML, CSS, and JavaScript along the way. What I'm doing for my slides is I'm creating a collection because Eleventy is going to take Markdown files that are anywhere inside my project structure, and it's going to try to convert those into HTML files. So when I want to just work with only the slides, I'm creating this function that's finding only the markdown files that are in my slides directory where I'm placing them. And it's saving them to a variable, and then I'm sorting them. You'll see, I'll show you the slides by their file slug. So everything before the file extension, because I've got my slides numbered. That's what I'm saving it as. Then we'll reference this file in the future. But then down here, I've got a shortcode for the slideshow that's taking this slides collection and it's mapping over it to create this template. So that for each slide, I was basically throwing it inside So it's throwing it inside this article tag. So this is dynamically generated inside of my article tag, right? Feel free to stop me if any of this is confusing. And then I've got a couple other templates here, but other than that, I'm designating the directories where different things live, and then pushing some static files that I don't want to try to render as HTML over there, like my images, my CSS, my client-side JavaScript, my favicon, which is a really cool little jar jam. So back in the repo, got source directory. I've organized it this way so that the slides are just here. Pick one at random. Let's pick 5.7. And so you can see what it looks like raw. I did click open raw. Yeah, so this is what it looks like in the CSS file, where I've just got every. This should look familiar if you've ever used Jekyll before, where there's front matter at the top of my markdown file. Anyone confused by this? It's set aside by these 3 dashes, and I can put these key value pairs. So this is written in YAML. You can write this in a variety of different syntaxes, but YAML's the one that works out of the box with Eleventy. Where I've got this class list object that's an array that I'm using to add this class for for making the emoji size according to the viewport. And then all that's in there is what's on that slide, it's the emoji. So if we work our way back through, those are basically the slides. Then the includes directory is where all the fun stuff is, where I've got my assets, where my client-side JavaScript lives, and those other things. We can explore that a little bit if you want. But my layouts that I'm writing entirely in JavaScript, heaven forbid. So I'm exporting a function that's taking in Eleventy's data object, that's created for each page, has its own unique data object, which uses that front matter or any other data that I would want to associate with that content. Eleventy is a lot more complicated. It can be a lot more complicated than I'm making it. Or have a lot more complex use case than just a slideshow. But where I've got this HTML wrapper so that inside the head tag, I'm minifying these 2 CSS files from a stringified version of them. Those are 2 of the functions that I created in the .eleventy.js file. And then right here is what allows me to chain layouts into one another. So the rest of the content goes inside here. So I'm reusing this code snippet for my base layout that also works on these other 3. So let's start with the slideshow. Inside the slideshow, it's going to be wrapped by the base layout. And then I've got a form form over here that is activated by this group of little jam stuff down here, where I'm like, well, what was your favorite slide? Was it slide 30? Where we can go to slide 30, for instance. And I'm just doing that with CSS. There's probably a better way to do it. You could make that state-based if you wanted. That'd be cool. So that you're fetching the slide data that you're not using. But I figured since it's a slideshow, you may as well have the whole thing in the document for caching purposes. Yes?
How did you switch the slide using CSS?
Oh, yes. Okay, so, pop quiz time. I looked up how to do it, and then I put no. So I'm using absolute positioning. So I created, oh, this is here. Rather than just telling you, I also want to show you is the thing, right? So inside the slides directory, something that I forgot to show you that's all important. So you have that front matter data, right? You remember that you can have it at the top of each markdown file, optionally. There isn't front matter in every data file, just ones that I wanted to add a class to, for instance. Then down here at the bottom, you also have this slides.json file. You could also, Eleventy has the option where you could save this as a JavaScript file and create like your JSON functionally somehow. But this is kind of like a set of parent data where every markdown file inherits this data that's in this directory. So I'm applying these types, and the important part here is slide type. I'm giving it a slide type of centered text. Then inside my CSS, inside my layout I have it saved to a data attribute. And then inside my CSS, see I have this data attribute data slide type equals centered text. Which slide are we on? We're on slide 37. So, right? No, we're on slide 30. So you can see how we have this class of show that's being applied to it. So that I've bound it to different keys. This is client-side JavaScript. So that's actually what I want to show you. So inside my assets directory, here's assets, JS. So like you could use reveal.js or something like that, but that's like 6,000 lines of code. Or you could use this, which is like 149. And what we're doing on the client, I'm caching some variables here at the top, and I've got this function goToSlide that takes in a number, and it removes the class and then adds it to the new one, basically. Also updates the slide count in the footer and the number inside that form, so the form always shows the current slide. Then functions for advancing next or previous. That's setting the slide count that you saw down at the bottom of the footer. This removes the start button from the DOM, that's why I have that there. And I've got a bunch of event handlers. So the click handler is adding that class of show for clicks. It's also doing that for key bindings for the enter key, spacebar, right arrow, and the L key versus the left arrow and the H key. So what I would like to find a way to add that I haven't figured out yet is a swipe event, so that you could also go backwards on mobile rather than just advancing forward on mobile. Something that I've thought about. I don't know how much time I have. I did have a demo.
Yeah, you're good.
You good? Do you want to see kind of how Eleventy works? Can I share my screen somehow? Like if I.
Are you not sharing it?
Well, so it's not like I'm using Zoom where I'm screen casting.
Cool.
I mean, so
Mirror your display.
I could mirror my display, I suppose. So that's in the settings somewhere. I'm not seeing what you're seeing. It's basically what I'm trying to say. Okay, so now you can see what I'm doing. I can see what I'm doing. Good. So here we are inside my terminal. Do I need to make this bigger? Would this be helpful in larger text? Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay. So I've got this prompt that I'm working through where what we want to do, what I don't have the ability to do that I would love the ability to do, right, inside here, is I would love to be able to edit this slide somehow rather than remember what slide number I have it saved as. Does that sound like a fun thing to do? I think it's a useful option. So what I want to do, first of all, I don't have in my package.json file, is I need to add this, I need to add where my repo lives. So what did I do? I don't know. How did I enter visual? Okay. So I want to add the repository to my package.json. Okay, I've done that. Good. Next thing I want to do is I want to create a shortcode so that I can plug in and edit this link page somewhere. I'll walk through the shortcode, but I'm going to put it inside my Eleventy.js file, in the configuration file, in a convenient spot. So let's say alphabetically, for lack of a better place to put it, this is where my shortcodes start. So I'm just going to put that in there and tap it over. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit so we can see more of what's going on. Is that still good for everyone? Okay, so what's happening here is on the Eleventy configuration object, I'm creating a shortcode named edit this page, and I'm generating a function where I'm taking in Eleventy's data object and this optional string of text, and then I'm rendering this template whenever I call it. So it's going to be a link with the class of edit link, and then the href is taking Eleventy's data object and it's looking in the package.json file for that repository object. And what I need to do, thank you, is this needs to be repository.url. And then it's adding the rest of the GitHub logic, and then it's taking from the page variable, it's taking that input path, which is going to be the file slug plus the file extension. So 0.md, 1.1.md, whatever, wherever that file lives. So this is creating a link to the file on GitLab. And then we got a ternary operator here where if I've got an edit link, it'll use the edit link text. Otherwise, it's going to just say edit this page. Okay? So that works for part of it. Normally, what I like to do with my shortcodes is I like to save them outside of my Eleventy configuration file and just require them here. And if I do that, I can use the shortcodes inside my Eleventy.js file. But if you don't do that, you can't. So, and I didn't want to add that layer of complexity. So I'm also going to add this chunk to the existing shortcode that I have on the slideshow, right? So right here before the closing section tag, each section is now going to have a footer. Not what I meant to do. It's going to have a footer, almost, with that link in it, right? Good. And that's all that we need to do inside the Eleventy configuration file, so that step 3 of 5 is to add that link into the template file itself, right? So we're going to go into that file. And go down here. What did I want to add? I wanted to add this without the plus signs. So I have to do this a little bit like this. I wanted to add, that's right, move this up to a footer. What am I doing? I guess we'll just do this. Because I did think about this. Organize my white space later, except we can't have two closing main tags, that'd be bad, right? Let's see if I broke this. Don't need that anymore. Does this look like valid HTML, everyone? No, it does not. Does that look like that now?
You've got two return to slideshows.
Hmm?
You've got two return to slideshows.
Yes, so are we saying that, what do we want to get rid of? So we want the one that has that in it. There we go. Where we're closing the article tag. There we go. That was helpful. Good. So we've got a footer for the article and we've got a footer for the main tag because we're saving two different pieces of information. One of them we're rendering based on the contents of the slide. The other one is staying constant. Or we're using client-side JavaScript to add the slide number. So finally, or almost finally, I have to add some CSS so it doesn't look stupid. So we're going to go in here, open my CSS file, and somewhere here near the bottom, right here with the data attributes, we're going to add 3 styles. First of all, we all good with CSS Grid? We're not? Okay, what I'm doing is I'm adding a logic that makes the rows of the grid distribute evenly, because they weren't being distributed evenly before. And then anything that has that edit link class applied to it has an anchor tag inside of it. It's using a similar positioning to what we already have for the footer, but it's just different enough that it needs its own rule. And then we're overriding that because anything that has a class of text block that's sizing depending on the viewport, so the emoji are the right size when you're viewing it on a mobile device. I'll show you that later if you want to see it. We're basically overriding that because it's an element level rule, so we need to use important in the inline rule. And that's all that we need in that file. Let's see if we broke it. npx Eleventy-serve. And it's built in 0.91 seconds. Runs the entire slideshow. Starting the slideshow. Oh look, edit this slide. Boom. Hooray, right? So it's kind of cool. It's legit. Any final thoughts, questions? Yes?
So do you reuse a lot of the JavaScript that you write across different projects?
Yeah, I do. But every project is just different enough that it's easier to copy and paste than it is to like maintain my own boilerplate.
Yeah. So how do you mentioned that you don't always, you're not the one maintaining your project.
Not necessarily.
Do you have old clients that say they ran into a bug and call you up and tell you to fix it? Like
Yeah. Yeah, but I try not to do that sort of thing. A lot of my clients don't want to pay me to maintain it. They just want to pay for the product. So I create the product for them. and they have someone local who is just dangerous enough that I can teach how it works.
Gotcha.
And it's so much easier to teach someone how to use this, right, than it is to teach them how to maintain a WordPress site on the back end. Or, because they don't need to be back-end experts, they just need to know basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And they can go in and they can change something if they want to.
So they're often working with you as you develop the site.
Yeah, that's what I would expect from my clients in the first place.
That makes sense.
Any questions about the little thing that I built? Yes?
So how does the JAMstack work with backend, like databases or APIs?
Yeah, so there are a couple
I know
different
that.
options. You can use a CMS. You could use a headless CMS if you wanted. So this is actually hosted on Netlify, right? So I'm going to log into my Netlify account here so I can show you. This is my little jamstack.netlify.com slideshow. And here are all my deploys that are based on my different Git commits. And I could, if I wanted to, come into my deploys, check these things out. That'll go to my GitLab instance. That's how I want to do it. There is a CMS in here that is basically a layer on top of my Git instance, where there's a GUI that's hooked up to the front matter, where you can set all sorts of fun stuff if you want. There are apps like Contentful that are more API driven, so if you have a database and you're publishing to an API, even if it's an in-house API and it's behind your firewall and behind your VPN, and you're handling authorization, however you're handling authorization to access those endpoints, Eleventy, for instance, can consume that data, and it can generate your content at build time. You could even throw, just like I did with collections, with the markdown files inside my directory, I could do that with something inside my data directory, which could be an API call itself. Does that make sense? So one of the, you have the option, kind of like with a React app, where you're basically throwing an empty DOM up there with a div element with an ID, and you're pushing everything in there on the client side, where there's just enough HTML in there to get the page load, and then you're serving you're turning it into a single page app once the page is loaded, right? You can do JAMstack-y stuff like that. There's Gatsby.js, which is a JAMstack-based React app that's taken off. It's about to have an IPO, I think. Or you could do something like I'm doing with Eleventy and create as much of your content as possible as static, and then whatever you absolutely need to be interactive for like user-generated content or something, where you're using a push request, then you do that with client-side JavaScript, and you have your API keys like you would anyway. Only you don't have to write a PHP template for it. It's part of your JavaScript workflow. Does that answer your question? Sweet.
While there's more questions, should I get set up?
Yeah.
Yeah, why don't we switch out while you're doing Q&A?
Awesome. Any more questions?
Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Up next we have Justin Meyer, who's a pillar of the JavaScript community here in Chicago.
Pillar, yeah. Thank you. So, because I was going to talk about this React thing that I'm working on, but I'll show that at the end since there's a little bit of time. I want to talk about web components, how proxy works, and a little bit how classes work. Really, this presentation is about CanJS 6, its design choices, but we're going to learn about those things while we learn about CanJS. So at the end of this talk, I hope that all of y'all will have a better understanding of web components, reactive observables. Who's used Vue here, or Ember, or Knockout? One person. What does everybody else? React? Yeah. Angular. Angular is kind of similar to this, reactive observables. I'm going to talk about how those frameworks work, and then I'm also going to talk about how the new proxy API works, the ES6 proxy API. At the end of this, I hope that you also are disappointed in Decorator's spec. For those, anybody use Decorators yet? No? So maybe you won't be disappointed in it because we won't talk about it then. And then the desire to check out CanJS. So let's first talk about, for those who don't know, me and Kevin here, we are the, well, now he heads CanJS. That's why he's got that sweet t-shirt on. And I'm the CEO of Bitovi. We work on a JavaScript library, not nearly as popular as the ones that you are using, but Apple Store was built with it, a few other popular sites, Chase, I think. Cars.com for a while was at least built in it. And we are updating CanJS 5 to CanJS 6. CanJS 5 looked like this, pretty standard component stuff. You have a build components, custom elements, you have a view, and a view model. But we wanted to modernize this for CanJS 6. There's just some gross stuff that we wanted to get rid of. First is we had a custom class type. Gross. Second, you had to predefine all your properties on your view model for them to actually be observable. If any of you had used Vue.js, you would know how annoying that is.
Is that like some of the TypeScript?
It's, yeah, you can think of it that way, where you've got to define everything before it can be used. And then you must, and then also, I got my order on here. All of these properties weren't actually on the element, the custom element itself. They were on this view model thing. It was really tricky. People didn't quite understand some of those problems, and we wanted to work around them. So for CanJS 6, Kevin and I set about adding some new goals to CanJS's existing goals. So CanJS' existing goal is to provide an imperative style of programming. This is basically methods and properties with as few new APIs as possible. We want to make it as easy to start as possible. Then we want to make it so, kind of like TypeScript, you can do a more rigorous approach later. And there's also no build required for modern browsers. You shouldn't have to set up Babel or Webpack to use CanJS. And then we added those goals that we just talked about. So I'm going to talk about how we made all of this work for CanJS 6. But before we do any of that, we have to talk about web components. Has anybody built a web component here? Has anybody ever heard of web components? Okay. So let's talk about why they're terrible. But first, let's talk about what they are. What web components are, it's a series of 3 different standard technologies that are used to try to make reusable custom elements. If anybody's ever used the video element in your page, there's a video tag that you can use. But if you notice the video tag, it has controls. There's a play button inside there. There's a little, you can move what part of the video you're watching. There's a time picker. So how browsers make that work is the video element actually has hidden elements inside of it and hidden functionality. And they're exposing all of that functionality that they use to build new custom elements to us. And there's a raging debate that if you follow me on Twitter, Justin B. Meyer, if you follow me on Twitter, you'll see me raging in this debate with a lot of other other JavaScript people about whether web components is a failed standard or not. Let me talk a little bit more about how it works. So this is how you would create the Hello World custom element. You create a class, Hello World, that extends HTML element. There's a bunch of lifecycle hooks that you can use. In this case, when the element is inserted into the DOM, we're just going to insert Hello World, and we're just going to show Hello World inside of whenever someone has a hello world element. And once you have your class, you just tell, hey, whenever there's a hello world tag element in the page, you want this class to control the behavior. And that is the custom element spec. That's the most important part to me of the web component spec. Now, I'm about to give all these reasons why the web component spec is super hard to program against. Why, when a lot of people say, oh, the web component spec was a failed standard, they say it's because nobody builds native web components because it's really, really hard. However, I'm a big believer in web components. I think every single framework should be able to work with and produce web components. So you were just talking about how, oh, you like your stuff to what you program to last forever, right? So you try to keep it as low level as possible. Web components are the best way that frameworks can allow for interoperability in the future. If React right now, for all those who are using React, people have learned about hooks recently. Everybody's talking about hooks. What if React drops the old form of class-based set state type components, right? Removes that. Well, you're going to have to convert to use hooks, or maybe there's some integration library. Something has to exist. Custom elements provide the an integration point. So if React said, hey, we're going to create custom elements, then there's an integration point that exists forever. There's a standard spec integration point that will exist forever. So if there's one thing to take away from this presentation, if you do care about the future of the code that you write, try to get those frameworks to invest in web components. Now, with that being said, let's talk about why they're very hard to use. So web components, everything that you would use, like a reactive view, an Angular, everything that you would use, they make very hard. Everything like a React, what you're trying to do with React is update the state, update the DOM. Web components make it so much harder to do that than your framework of choice. And let's just see some basic examples. So very commonly, if you have a React component or view component, you want to get that component and you want to say, hey, here's some new data. I'm going to pass it new props. What does it look like to make a full name that just displays a first and last property? What does it look like to make that update? So this is a little small here. So here, here's my full name element. It's saying hello, Justin Meyer, because at the end, I'm getting full name and I'm setting its first and last property. You can see here I have these weird, I'm just gonna kind of gloss over this, so don't worry if you're not totally keeping up, but just hear my voice and understand what I'm telling you is the truth. You have to do all this crazy getter setter stuff and calling some renderer in order to just get it so when you set first, you're gonna re-render. When you set last, you're gonna re-render. Every other framework, you update the state, it does it automatically. These setters, as we'll see, can become more and more problematic as you want them to do things like be easily testable. Let's see the next one. So with a lot of frameworks, you want some form of event. So if something happened in this component, you want to broadcast that to the world, let other people know that there's a change. So if I wanted, I'm going to have a counter every time the user increases the count. I want to produce an event saying the count has been updated. Let's see how obnoxious it is to do that. So here, as I'm clicking, you can see it's logging a new count down here. But what I need to do now in my setter is dispatch a custom event. So here, every time the count is set, I'm going to update the inner text and make sure that it's showing the right thing, the number is changing down there. But also critically, I'm dispatching a custom event. That doesn't come for free like it does with every other framework. next thing, custom elements, people expect to be able to set attributes and properties, right? So that counter, I should be able to say, hey, count equals 5. I want to put that as an attribute. I don't want it just specified as a property. I want to kind of manage that weird connection between attributes and properties that DOM elements have. So let's see how obnoxious that is. So here, the DOM, here, if you want to listen to when users set attributes, you have to implement this observe attributes callback. And you have to list, sorry, this is the, you have to specify your observed attributes as a property or a getter. And here's the attributes we want to know when they change. And then I have to specify the callback to handle any time the attribute is set. And then what I'm doing in here is I'm essentially setting the count. And then the count gets re-rendered how we saw it previously. But again, look at everything I have to do just to say, hey, I want to work with attributes as well as properties. Okay. And the final thing is testing can be very hard here. Testing these components can be tricky unless you do things right. So I'm building this myCounter class here. I'm defining it. And let's say I wanted to test it. I simply want to do new myCounter, create a counter element, and call increment on it to see that its number went from 0 to 1. This will throw an error. And the reason this throws an error is because when you call increment and set the count, it's going to assume there's that the element is connected, that there is that it's been rendered, that it hasn't, and try to update the DOM and dispatch custom elements, which won't work and will just throw an error. So instead, what you have to do is create your element and append it to the page, allowing it to render. Then you can call increment and see that the count has been updated to 1. So lifecycle things, making components that are easy to test is also very hard with straight native web components. Okay, so now let's talk about CanJS. That sets up the purpose for CanJS, and we're going to talk about how CanJS works and how it makes all of that possible, like fixing those problems possible. So first, okay. So this is what CanJS 6 looks like. You extend it's an HTML element. You would extend stash element, which essentially has a handlebars type view layer. And then everything else is just like a normal JavaScript class. You can just change properties and add new properties to your heart's content. And it does exactly what you would expect. It would say, hello, Earth. By the way, if people have questions, comments, please let me know, because I would love to convince you to actually check this out. So, you know, be as aggressive as you want, questioning everything I'm saying up here.
What's MJS?
What is what?
MJS.
MJS. That's a good question. So that is, MJS is the pseudo spec that people use to say that this is a module JavaScript file. So Node essentially by default sees MJS's and assumes it's the ES module syntax and not CommonJS syntax. So, it's really not, that's not us, that's like JavaScript Node ecosystem compatibility stuff. That's a good question. Question everything. Okay, so CanJS makes it, I'm just gonna basically skip through these slides. CanJS makes it easy to update the DOM on a state change. Essentially, you just have to set your properties and CanJS will automatically update the view for you. It also, if count changes, anytime a property changes in CanJS, it'll automatically dispatch an event handler for you. It also allows you to manage attributes and properties. There's this static props where you can define a lot of special behavior for your properties. Here I'm saying count, I want it to default to 0, and I want to connect it to the, in this case, the count property, so that, or the count attribute, so the attribute property will be two-way bound. I will post these slides, and there's source for all of them if you want to check it out. It also handles lifecycle stuff so that you can just create the class and test it without having to put it in the DOM or do any extra work there. And one of my favorite things is CanJS it has this very loose programming style that's very much like just normal JavaScript classes. That was its design goal. But you can make things incrementally more strict, which if you are fans of TypeScript or something like that, you'll appreciate. So here's just a basic custom element that is two-way bound to a value that a person would pass. So it would allow stuff like this. This would be a strict, we want to make this a strict input, where we're only going to allow people to pass it a string, and you must pass it a string. So we can get incrementally more strict. We can say, hey, I want, if someone forgets value, to throw. And tell people, nope, you got to pass a value. Well, you can do that with required true, say the value must be passed. Then if you want to say, I want it, so if someone passes a number, we're gonna throw up on them. You can say type string and say, we have to get a string past us. We cannot take a number. And then if someone gives us some other property, yes.
So how are you going to differentiate between a number and a character 5? Because you're using quotes on both values.
Yes. So this form for CanJS's bindings will actually set the property. So this will set the property to a number 5. And because it's type string, it will throw an error.
So there's a difference between value equals the string on the top line and value from equals the 5. That's the difference.
A lot of frameworks now have different syntaxes for setting attributes versus properties. So this is how you set an attribute, and this is how you set a property.
Yeah, but like, what if you're trying to use as a string that happens to have the number 5 in there? How can
That's fine.
Yeah, but then like,
Because if you pass well, if you wanted to pass a string here, you'd have to put another set of quotes inside of it. So this is almost treated like JSON inside here for this syntax.
Did you say that's different, the value and the val?
No, sorry. The top line value equals, and then the third line value from equals. That's what's differentiating.
Yeah.
Setting properties.
This is setting an attribute. This is setting a property. When I was talking about how there's a difference between properties and attributes in elements, that is a confusing point for a lot of people. And linking, like, if you've ever set the href property on an anchor, it behaves differently than the href attribute on an anchor element, right? Elements have these fuzzy relationships between properties and attributes. Anyways, the final thing I was going to say is you can also tell it if the wrong name was passed. You can also say, hey, if anything other than value is passed, this basically essentially seals the element, so it can't take any new properties. So if someone tried to give you the wrong thing, named it, typed the wrong thing, you would also throw. So this is probably one of my favorite new features of CanJS 6, is the ability to tell people like, hey, give me what you expect. Not going to talk about that. And now let's talk about how frameworks like CanJS, Vue, Ember, what was the last one? Angular kind of work to create reactive observables. But how we solved a particular problem with proxies. So, reactive observables really just mean if I have an object, I want to create what's known as either a reactive observable or compute from arbitrary values on other objects. So here I want to create a full name, reactive observable, that composes persons first. That should be, instead of object, that should be person. That's a mistype there, my apologies. That should be person.first plus person.last. I want to compose that value. And anytime I want to be able to listen to when full name changes, but what's really going to happen is anytime someone changes one of the source properties, so changes person.first or person.last, I'm going to see that full name changes. This is React, essentially the essence of reactive observables. This is what those frameworks that I talked about are all based on, how their state mechanics work. Right?
Justin?
Yeah.
I must have missed this, but can you just real quick state your argument? 'Cause I'm a little confused.
My argument for what?
For using CanJS.
I'm not really arguing for CanJS right now.
What?
I'm more talking about how it works.
I guess I'm just confused because initially I thought you said that web components, I guess you're saying they so far have done it wrong, or it's not?
Yeah, it's a subtle argument. Let's talk about web components. In case everybody missed what I was trying to say there. Web components, it's a double thing I'm saying. Web components on their own are very hard for new JavaScript developers to actually make use of. Right? It is a complex, difficult API to use to make them work, to make them behave like a real custom element should behave. That, despite saying that, I think it's incumbent upon framework authors to actually make when you build like a React component, it should actually compile to or build out to a native web component. And the reason for that is because it creates interoperability for every single framework that exists automatically. So the idea is like, we at Toby, I don't know, how many people have upgraded from one framework to another here? Which frameworks did you upgrade from between?
Oh, it was just Angular.
Angular to React, or?
Oh, no.
Okay, so we do this all the time. And like we work with a lot of old cars.com, right? Was before Backbone, then CanJS, then it was Angular, now I think is React.
And that's just in like the last 6 years.
But you're converting the same site to different frameworks?
Yeah.
Companies often do this.
Cars.com,
They got a new CTO or whatever that one is acquired.
Who uses React here? Right? But React is what, 3 years old? I mean, it's older than that, but really like its popularity, 2-3 years, right? There's kind of a cycle of frameworks coming and going. React is a little bit more permanent, but React itself is changing. And it feels like every couple years, a new framework, a new tool comes out. And if you want to be in business with good developers, you've got to like, oh, we can't be on this old backbone, like Cars might have been, and we got to be on this new React stuff because we're only going to get good talent if we're on the latest framework. But that puts enormous pressure on the company to keep upgrading all the time. It's very difficult. The reason why it's difficult is you have to rewrite your entire application. If you go from like Angular to React, you pretty much just have to rewrite it all from scratch. It's enormously expensive. Web components are a solution to that problem. Not a perfect solution, but a very good. If I wrote in the future, let's say there's Vue took over and there is no more React. We're all Vue developers 2 years from now. If React was exporting every component that you build as a web component, then you could immediately use those in a Vue application. You would incur the cost of the React runtime, so you're gonna have to load an extra 50K, but you would able to migrate your app slowly over time, right? Do the home page in React first, but some of the subcomponents, setting pages, things like that, leave those for later. So that's why I'm arguing how important web components are, but honestly, this argument is more about like, for everybody here, this argument is, if you're using a framework, you should, if you can, to the best of your ability, put pressure on your framework author to build out to web components. and to work well with web components, because it's safety for you. If anything changes for that company, they can immediately upgrade to new technology. And I have a personal gripe against React because they don't do that and they put pressure against it, because honestly, I think React is a little bit like Facebook in that it's a walled garden. You know, they've got a good thing going. Do they necessarily need to work with every other framework? But I wish that they would. So that's really the point that I'm getting at. And I'm just throwing a bunch of other stuff about web components and CanJS into this talk. It's a oddly flowing talk, but hopefully people are learning something. Let's keep going. Okay, so what I'm talking about now, to catch everybody up, if they're totally lost, I'm talking about how CanJS and other frameworks like Vue, how they work, how they're able to essentially, when you change a property in Vue or CanJS, how it's able to update the DOM. How things are, its basic core state mechanics work. And they work through this reactive value. Essentially, the idea is when state changes, like person first changes, I need to know about it. And I can build a function that kind of encompasses what state I care about and returns a DOM or some value. But I can listen to when any of its source properties change. And I want to talk about how this works real quick. And then we are done. So essentially, this is the implementation of person. The first thing you need is an add event listener. So when someone listens to person, you need to be able to, the reactive value needs to bind and listen to when first and when last change. So here it has a simple add event listener function that if you passed it first, it would register that handler to be called back whenever first is called. There's a setter for when first gets set, and it's essentially going to call all of the handlers that have been registered on first. So anybody who's bound to when first changes, we're going to set first and then call those functions back. And the real important part for how these frameworks are able to know that some source property has changed, whenever that source property is read, whenever first is read, it essentially tells the universe, hey, on this person object, first has been read. And then those reactive observables are able to see everything that was read and bind to those, as we'll see in the next slide. And my apologies, this is a very, I should have said from the very beginning, this is a very advanced talk I'm giving. So if you're struggling through it, my apologies. So how does that reactive observable work? So reactive observable is going to be passed a function, and then it also has an on that it can essentially set up the binding, and whenever anything in here changes, it needs to call back this function with the new value of full length. Okay, so again, reactive value takes a function, and whenever any source properties change, it needs to call back this function with the new value of full length. So here is essentially the implementation. Reactive value gets past that function. And we're just going to return an object with a on. And we're going to call, this is the full name function, the thing that returns the first and the last. And whenever on is called, we're immediately going to call the function, and then we're going to go through the recordings and essentially set up bindings. So basically, this calls that full name function. When the first and last getters are called, it's going to add those things to recordings, and we're going to loop through all of those and listen to those events. And when those events get called, when first gets called, essentially all we do is reevaluate the function. And that's basically it. Any questions?
So you're abstracting out the setters and getters and not the object.
Yes. So the idea is that like when a getter or setter happens, when you just set a property, it is telling the universe that, especially when you've read a property, it's telling the universe that like, hey, something cares about this, so that you can listen to it when it changes and update the DOM in the future, right? Yeah. And this is how they all work. I mean, this is also like how RxJS works in some of its abilities. You can do similar stuff there too. So with CanJS, we wanted to get rid of what we had to do and Vue had to do, which is define every single property ahead of time. So in Vue, you have to just say, hey, we care about message, because Vue is creating a getter setter for message to allow this kind of computed value to work. And the way we got rid of it is with proxies. And I'm just going to say this at a very high level. Proxies allow you to set traps, getter setter traps on objects. Anybody use Ruby here? Method missing? You know what I'm talking about? In Ruby, you can say, you can essentially trap anytime someone tries to read a property that doesn't exist. Proxies do the same thing for JavaScript. So the idea here is I can create a person object that whatever property they read, or whatever property they set, I'm going to get this function called back. It's a trap. I'm like Admiral Akbar right now. I can basically anytime someone, does that make sense? People understand that conceptually? Proxies, right? Okay, let's go on. So all we really did, I guess, to make CanJS work in this new version is we made it so whenever we use the proxies on our essentially our components are proxied, so that whenever properties are being set or retrieved, we can do all of that reactive logic. Whenever a property is set, we can call all the event handlers. And whenever a property is read, we can make sure that we're telling any other system, hey, this property is being read, you can hook into this reactive observable system. So proxies are that trap. Now, one final thing is what I really came to talk about was...
How much overhead have you noticed with the proxies?
Not much. They're faster than you, like, well...
They very rarely get hit. So like the proxy is only going to get hit the first time a property is read or set that doesn't exist. And then after that, we set up a getter setter pair.
Oh, okay. Oh, you back.
So that it doesn't hit the proxy.
Okay.
So it's really just the first time you create a property that doesn't exist.
So, in a rage last week about the importance of web components, I was annoyed that React doesn't work with web components well, so I created a library called React to Web Component that essentially you can pass it a React component. So here I've created a React component called greeting, and I can pass greeting to React Web Component, and out pops a custom element that you can then define. And then you can use it just like you would any other HTML element. You know, I can just set my document body to web greeting, and then I can set the name property of the web greeting element, and then the page just updates. So this is a really cool way if you have to export your if you have React and you want to use, someone else wants to use the component that you've built, you can just wrap it with this and it should just work. And tying everything together in my masterstroke of a presentation right now. And it's all gonna loop together. It's all be like, wow. This uses proxies to make the component work. All essentially we do is we take the React component, we're going to create a JavaScript constructor function, then we set up a proxy to trap anytime anybody sets a property on that custom element. All we're going to do is tell React to re-render. That's basically what's happening in here. All that's essentially happening is it's calling this re-render React, where it's just going through all the properties on our custom element and then forwarding them to React to re-render and redraw that component. So this makes we're just trapping everything gets set, forward it right down to React, and it looks and works just like a normal web component. To me, it's almost magic. So that's my presentation. Any questions? I covered a lot of it. Yeah.
Do you guys Polymer things or not?
I like Polymer. I've never built anything substantive with it. I like the idea. It pushed these things further. I don't know if you need Polymer now. If you're really looking to build web components, A, you can check out CanJS, but B, also lit HTML is a good alternative. Hmm?
That's part of Polymer. It's from the Polymer team.
Oh, that's from the Polymer team. Okay, that makes sense, yeah. Yeah, build stuff in web components. Use frameworks that build out to web components. Your code will last a lot longer, I promise you. That's it. Thanks, everybody.
So thanks a lot, guys, for coming. If you have proposals for new talks, please come to our site and submit it. Or if you just want to share something about different stuff that you're working on, then also please. We have 5-minute, 10-minute presentations as well as longer ones. So.
We're also, I'm pretty sure there's going to be a Vue talk by Tanya October 22nd. She did the beginner React one that was pretty well received here. So if you're interested in Vue 2 months from now, that'll be a really good one to attend.
Yeah, Tanya's really good. You guys will like it. Okay, thanks a lot.